I don't know about you, but sometimes I find when I'm reading stories in the Bible that I wish there was more to them, more of a story development. Not to say that the Bible is incomplete or there's not enough teaching in the verses and stories and scriptures that we have recorded for us, but sometimes the Bible ends up taking just a very few short verses to talk about some major events happening. I often think of the story of Samson and some of the wild things that happen in that story that are just like, I would love to know more about that. That would be very exciting to see. Of course, a lot of the spiritual meat is there for us. But I often find myself wishing there was more character development or more story development to kind of relate more to stories in the Bible. Because it's interesting, I think, for us to make connections with history, with the people of the Bible, crossing paths sometimes we don't realize, understanding more about the times that they lived, and just trying to imagine what life may have been for them. And for me, this certainly is the case with someone by the name of Mark. I'm not talking about myself, but Mark in the Bible. Now, when you think of Mark in the context of the Bible, you probably think first of the Gospel of Mark. And that's certainly natural, and Mark's gospel is the shortest of the four, and it's very fast-paced. It's just gets to like the adventure side of things and gets through the gospel story quite quickly compared to the other three gospels. Because of the amount of overlap between Mark's gospel and Matthew and Luke's, scholars believe that Mark's gospel was written first, and that it was likely used as a bit of an outline for Matthew and Luke's Gospels. But I want to look at today, who was Mark? What can we learn about him? Because it's very little is actually recorded about him in the Bible. There's only a very few verses that even mention him in the Bible. But God used him to record, some of what we have today to learn about the life and the ministry of Christ. So I think it's interesting to look more into the individual and see what we can learn through him. I want to take a look at the Bible, what the Bible does record about Mark, so that we can learn more about this particular gospel writer. We can learn a lot from him, and he had a lot of interactions with other key figures in the New Testament, namely Peter, Paul, and Barnabas. Now, it's possible that the first mention of Mark is a bit of an awkward introduction to our gospel writer. He's not mentioned by name, but most believe that he may have been in the Garden of Gethsemane on the night that Jesus was betrayed and captured. This is recorded for us in Mark chapter 14. This is the context here is right before Christ is taken away. And in Mark 14, verse 50, it says, "Then they all forsook him and fled," meaning they all forsook Christ and they fled. "Now a certain young man followed him," Christ, "having a linen cloth thrown around his naked body. And the young men laid hold of him, and he left the linen cloth and fled from them naked." Now, it's a very strange occurrence to have happened in a very solemn place, or solemn occasion, or solemn situation. An expositor's Bible commentary explains the verse this way. It says, quote, "Only Mark records this mysterious episode. The, quote, young man is not identified, but the consensus is that he is Mark. Why else would he insert such a trivial detail in so solemn a story? Was this Mark's way of saying, I was there? Why he was there was not explained." So it's not really known if that really was him, but it's interesting that in such a short gospel that he included that particular story. Now, Mark isn't really mentioned being around Christ any other time that we can see, but many traditions claim that the Gospel of Mark is really comprised of a lot of recollections of Peter. It seems that the two of them were very close. Mark was with Peter when he wrote 1 Peter. We read that in 1 Peter 5 and verse 13. Peter calls him Mark, my son. as he was giving some of the greetings in the letter. So he kind of looked at him as a son and maybe was a bit of a mentor to him. So they certainly seemed like pretty close to each other. And it was in the episode where Peter was released from prison by the angel in Acts 12. This is really the first real mention we have of Mark in the scripture. If you remember that, an angel breaks Peter out of prison. And Peter is very, very surprised about the whole event and what's happening. And he was fleeing, trying to escape capture again. And in Acts 12, it tells us that he flees to the house of Mary, the mother of John, whose surname was Mark, where many were gathered together praying. That's in Acts 12, verse 12. So Mark sometimes is called by his Jewish name of John, and sometimes by his Roman name of Mark. Sometimes it's put together as John Mark. So Mark's mother must have had a large home that liked to entertain other believers, and it seems like this was a gathering place for the early church there in Jerusalem. But Peter ran to them for refuge and for hiding. So he must have had somewhat of a close relationship with Mark and his mother, at least. So this happened around the year 44, to give you some context of things with other events there in the New Testament. The next time that Mark is mentioned is in really kind of the end of that chapter 12 of Acts, where he's traveling with Barnabas and Paul. This was the start of Paul's first evangelistic journey, and he had taken Barnabas and Mark with him. Mark was their assistant and kind of helper along the way, but he also was Barnabas' cousin. In the first part of this trip, they traveled to the island of Cyprus, which happened to be where Barnabas was from. And in Acts 13, in verse 13, we read, this is fairly early on, I think, in this particular journey that they were traveling to different churches. We read in Acts 13:13 that John, being John Mark here, departed from them, returning to Jerusalem. Now, we don't know why Mark left the group, but we do know that Paul was not especially happy with him. Paul and Barnabas continued the trip, preaching the gospel to others there in that eastern Mediterranean region. We know that Paul wasn't very happy because a number of years later, around 50 AD, Paul proposed to Barnabas that they visit those cities again that they visited on their first journey. And Barnabas wanted Mark to go with them. This was about 6 years after that first trip. Let's read that account in Acts 15. Acts 15 in verse 36. So it says, then after some days, Paul said to Barnabas, let us now go back and visit our brethren in every city where we have preached the word of the Lord and see how they are doing. Now Barnabas was determined to take with them John, called Mark. But Paul insisted they should not take with them the one who had departed from them and had not gone with them to do the work. Then the contention became so sharp that they parted from one another. And so Barnabas and Mark sailed to Cyprus. So, maybe rightfully so, Paul thought that Mark was going to be unreliable, maybe not quite so committed to their mission as much as they were. It seems that he pretty much abandoned them the first time around. But Barnabas must have thought fairly highly of Mark. He knew his character because he petitioned to have Mark go with them even after he left them on the first trip. Now, we certainly don't know all the details of this particular story, but Mark must have also been willing to go with them, even knowing how their first journey went. Their first journey was certainly filled with a lot of trials. They were preaching to the Jews and were persecuted and accused of blasphemy. Paul and Barnabas had to flee multiple times and were even stoned close to death. But Mark seems to have had some sort of a change that has happened in this interim time. He must have had faith that their journey would be successful this time and that he could be of better service than he was that first time. So Mark and Barnabas did not end up going with Paul, but instead went their own way to Cyprus. Now, there's no biblical record of what happened, and that's really the last time that we hear of them in Acts. But according to some traditions, Barnabas was martyred on the island of Cyprus, and he was buried there by Mark. So what happened between Paul and Barnabas relating to this whole issue over Mark? The Bible doesn't really tell us if Barnabas and Paul ever met again, but Paul does mention Barnabas in his letter to the Galatians, which was probably written about 53 to 54 during Paul's second evangelistic journey. And later he also mentions him in this letter, first letter to the Corinthians. In these letters, Paul speaks highly and kindly of Barnabas and regards him as an equal in ministering to the people. At some point during those years, they must have had some sort of reconciliation for that to have happened. But what about Paul and Mark? Did they make up? Did they reconcile? Paul mentions Mark in Colossians, a book he wrote while he was in prison around the year 61 to 63, so a good amount of time from when this first happened. We read about that in Colossians 4, in verse 10. So in Colossians 4 and verse 10, there's a brief mention here of Mark. And Paul here writes, "Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, greets you with Mark, the cousin of Barnabas, about whom you received instructions." And the instructions were, if he comes to you, welcome him. "And Jesus, who is called Justus. These are my only fellow workers of the kingdom of God who are of the circumcision. They have proved to be a comfort to me." So this is about 10 years earlier. Paul basically wanted nothing to do with Mark. Now he refers to him as his fellow worker for the kingdom and a comforter to me. Around that same time, Paul wrote Philemon, and in that he sent greetings from Mark and others and referred to them as his fellow laborers. Now, Mark wasn't in prison with Paul when he was writing these things, but they must have had some sort of contact. So it's possible that maybe Mark was his messenger while he was a prisoner, being Paul's eyes, ears, and legs, trying to get around to visit people when he couldn't. And towards the end of his life, Paul wrote to Timothy to come to him quickly and to bring Mark, quote, "For he is useful to me for ministry." So what can we learn about all of these individuals, and especially about Mark's story? What we know of Mark's story is that it's very much intertwined with Paul and Barnabas. Through the three of them, we see wonderful examples of reconciliation and of faith. Paul and Mark's relationship was obviously rocky at the beginning, back during that first journey. Paul pretty much thought he was useless. But years later, he considered Mark very useful to his ministry, a fellow worker in preaching the kingdom of God, and someone he wanted to be around him when he neared death. Although we don't have any details of exactly what happened, we can see a story there probably of reconciliation between Paul and Mark. They didn't let a rift between them last, and although it was years later, they found reconciliation. We saw the same with Paul and Barnabas. We can also learn from Mark that with faith, we can turn our weaknesses into strengths. Mark was probably part of one of the first attempts to preach the gospel to the world. That's quite an amazing opportunity to think about in hindsight, and a wonderful opportunity that he had to serve God. But something certainly happened to him that caused him to turn away from that and not want to continue in that service at that time, at least. What we have recorded shows that he didn't quit, though, and his faith must have grown stronger as he matured. Now, we all have our own ups and downs in our lives. We have weaknesses and strengths, challenges to our faith. Over time, Mark became a blessing to those who he had let down and who he had disappointed. It can be the same for us. When we recognize our weaknesses and with a willing heart ask God to help us grow in our faith so that we can serve him just like Mark.